Okay, let's turn to the second part of the problem set, which is the more technical one. And we have a scenario, which is there are two countries, Vinyadia and Textilia. Each country can produce wine and cloth. Vinyadia has 6 workers, and one Vinyadian worker can produce either 1 unit of cloth or 2 units of wine. Textilia has 5 workers, and one Textilian worker can produce 6 units of cloth or 3 units of wine. And both countries always want to consume as many units of wine as cloth. So it's a similar scenario as we did in the lecture, but different numbers. And before we answer all those questions, let's just solve the entire problem, which is we need to draw the production possibility frontiers. We need to determine how much they produce and consume in the autarky, how do they specialize, and how do they trade, and how much can they consume after trade. Okay, so let's start with Vinyadia and the worker allocation. So I just called it worker allocation. So we can allocate the workers towards wine and towards cloth. Well, I can tell nobody works at wine, but then everyone works at cloth. But if one works at wine, only 5 can work at cloth, or 2 and 4, 3 and 3, 4 and 2, 5 and 1, 6 and 0. So those are the combinations how I can send my workers to work. Wine and cloth. So if we do that, what is the output? So output of wine and cloth. Okay, so one worker can produce 2 units of wine, so I need to multiply the values in the first column by 2. So that's 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And for cloth, one worker can produce 1 unit of cloth, so we multiply this column, the second one, with the workers times 1. And of course that is just then 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay, so the production possibility frontier for Vinyadia, and let's make that green. So let's make that maybe in green. So okay, so that goes from a maximum of cloth of 6 to a maximum of wine of 12. So let's draw that quickly. So that starts here at 6. And goes till 12. Okay, and now 6. Okay, shapes. Okay, it seems like I can't draw here something. Ah, now it works. So it goes from 6 to 12. Okay, let's make it green. Okay, so that is the production possibility frontier for Vineyardia. Now let's do the same thing for Textilia, but here we have only 5 workers. So how can we allocate them? And let's just do it again. So I do that here, worker allocation. Okay, towards wine and cloth. Okay, so now I have only 5, so that's 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if no one works on wine, of course 5 work on cloth. And then 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Then what about the output of wine and cloth? Okay, so a textilian worker can produce 6 units of cloth or 3 units of wine. So if you multiply the wine column by 3, we get 0, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, and can produce 6 units of cloth. So we multiply the cloth column by 6, so that is 30, 24, 18, 12, 6, 0. Okay, so let's draw that one and let's make that maybe red. So that goes from 30 to 15. Okay, from 30 cloth to 15 here. Okay, and again we make that red. Okay, red is Textilia and green is Vineyardia. Of course there is a shortcut. You don't have to do this table. I just did it now to go over everything again in detail. But when you have such a linear relationship, you also could have said, okay, let's take a look at Textilia. If I take all 5 workers and I let them only produce cloth, 5 times 6, that's 30. But if I use all the workers to produce wine, 5 times 3, that's 15. And then you just connect 30 to 15. So you don't have to do technically a table. You can draw it right away, but I just wanted to do it because I think it makes things clearer. Okay, last thing, we want to do a 45-degree line. So that 45-degree line captures the idea that they always want to consume as many units of cloth as they want wine. So it's the same as in the problem set. And maybe let's dash it again. Format shape. Okay. Okay, so now we can see, so now we have a nice graph. And we can already determine how much they consume under autarky. So this point here, 4 and 4, that is Vineyardia, and under autarky, Textilia will consume 10 units of wine and 10 units of cloth. Okay. So now which country has a comparative advantage in what? So now we can take a look at the slope. So what is the slope of Vineyardia's PPF? 6, the rise over the run. So the slope is rise over the run, so that's negative 0.5. Just put it here, negative 0.5. And what's the slope of Textilia's PPF? that goes from 30 to 15, so that is -2. So now, for Vineyardia, if they produce 1 extra unit of wine, how many cloth do they give up? 0.5. But if Textilia wants to produce another unit of wine, they have to give up 2. So that means comparatively, Vineyardia produces wine cheaper because they only need to give up half a unit of cloth. So now we know that Vineyardia has a comparative advantage in wine. Okay, so then Textilia must have a comparative advantage in cloth. So now we ask, if Textilia wants to produce 1 extra unit of cloth, then how many units of wine do they need to give up? So if you take here, let's say you go up 1, you see you only go half to the left. So, but for Vineyardia, if you go up at any point 1, you produce 1 more cloth, you have to give up 2. So in other words, whenever we produce 1 extra unit more of the good displayed on the y-axis, we have to invert the slope. The slope tells you just the marginal opportunity cost of producing 1 extra unit of the good, which you see on the x-axis. Okay, so therefore Textilia has a comparative advantage in cloth. Okay, so how many units do they have of each? 4 and 10. So total under autarky. So so consumption under autarky, I write that here. Consumption, autarky, consumption, autarky. Okay, let's do it this way. We have here maybe Vineyardia, and here we have wine, cloth. Okay, and we said Vineyardia produces and consumes 4 on 4. And what about Textilia? We can see here 10 and 10. Okay, so this is what they consume under autarky. So now we also know that Vineyardia has a comparative cost advantage in wine. So and also Vineyardia is the country with the biggest constraint, because if we let Vineyardia fully specialize in what it can do the best, which is wine, they can only produce 12. But Textilia, they could produce 30 of cloth. So therefore, in a first step, let Vineyardia fully specialize and produce 12. That's the first step. Okay, I'll make it a little bit different, maybe, so we can see this is actually a different kind of dot. Okay. So this is consumption under autarky, and the one with the yellow inside, that is specialization. Okay, so now what about the second step? So in step 1, we let fully specialize the country with the biggest constraint, which is 12. Then in the next step, we also let Textilia produce 12 units of cloth. So now we have 12 units of wine, 12 units of cloth. But Textilia has still excess capacity. So how many workers does it take to produce 12 units of cloth? For Textilia, they have 5 workers, and 1 worker can produce 6 units of cloth. So that means we have only 2 units of workers so far employed. 3 are still available. And we use those remaining workers and we tell them, look, you have to produce equal numbers of wine and cloth. So insert shape. So we can think there is another 45-degree line here. So that's another 45-degree line. That makes sure that the remaining workers, those who are not already employed, produce equal numbers of wine and cloth. So okay. And then we know that Textilia is supposed to produce here 18. Okay, let's put a little smaller dotted side. Okay, good enough. Okay, so this is where they produce. Okay, so now how much wine and cloth is available after specialization? So let's call that availability after specialization. Availability after specialization. Okay, this is supposed to read availability after specialization. Okay, so let's have again Vineyardia. How much wine do they produce? And how much cloth? Okay, so they produce 12 units of wine and 0 units of cloth. What about Textilia? They produce 18 units of cloth and 6 units of wine. So now that means in total, let's make it here 2. So the sum, just call it S. So now we move from 14 each to sum S to 18 each. That means of each we have now plus 4 more. Okay. So now let's assume that the 2 countries, Vineyardia and Textilia, they sign again a trade agreement. And the trade agreement says every country gets whatever they had under autarky plus 50% of that extra production that we now have available in the world. And we put it on top of it. So that will mean each country gets 2 more units of wine and cloth in addition to what they had under autarky. So that means that Vineyardia, instead of having 4 and 4, they can actually consume now 2 more, 6 and 6, and And Textilia also gets 2 more. So instead of 10 and 10, they get now 12 and 12. Okay, so this is consumption after trade. Okay, so now we can quickly determine what the trade flows will be. So Vineyardia produces 12, but they can consume 6. That means, I'll put it here, Vineyardia will export 6 units of wine to Textilia. Textilia produces 18 units of cloth, but consumes 12. So in this case, we would observe that Textilia exports 6 cloth to Vineyardia. Okay, so now we should be able to answer those questions. In autarky, how many units of cloth will Vineyardia produce? So that's the 4. In autarky, how many units of wine will Textilia produce? So that's the 10. So that is 10. For Textilia, the opportunity cost of producing 1 extra unit of wine. Okay, 1 extra unit of wine is to forego 2 units of cloth. Is 2 foregone units of cloth. For Vineyardia, the opportunity cost of producing 1 extra unit of cloth is foregone units of wine. So Vineyardia, the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of cloth is the inverse of the 0.5, so that's 2. Under free trade, which statement is true? We said Vineyardia will specialize on wine, Textilia will specialize on cloth. So in this case, both A and B are correct. Under free trade, Vineyardia will produce how many units of wine? Okay, we said this is 12. Under free trade, Textilia will produce how many units of cloth? Okay, so this is the specialization and production under free trade. So they will produce 18 units of cloth. Under free trade, Textilia will produce how many units of wine? Well, they still produce 6 units of wine. And compared to joint production under autarky, how many more units of wine and cloth will be available after trade? So that is 4 of each. And okay, so now there is still, that should be actually not Portugal, I think that is Vineyardia. Vineyardia. And Textilia. Then Textilia exports. So this is a question about how many units do they export, and that we know is 6, which is not any of the answers yet. Let me quickly change that. 4, 6, 8. So the answer is 6. Okay, so that was still an older question that I forgot to change to the current one. Okay, so assuming that excess production, the plus 4, is equally shared between Vinyadia and basically added to the consumption levels under autarky, then Textilia exports 6 units of the good in which it has a comparative advantage, which is cloth. But the same would apply to Textilia. Okay, so that is something I hope is clear now, and if not, we'll still see in class, I guess, and can work on that a little bit more in case there's some need to. But I hope it is clear now. All right.